So, welcome to today's Brownbag seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Rydzewski, who is a visiting fellow currently at the Center for Southeastern European Studies. He received his PhD recently from the Department of Anthropology and Cultural Studies at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and he's been working actually on questions of migration. This was the topic of his PhD thesis. And also his fellowship here, where he's preparing a book manuscript based on his dissertation. And he's had a postdoctoral, he's been a doctoral fellow at CEU, as well as the Worth Institute of Austrian and Central European Studies in Alberta. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Robert, who will present his research on migration and the Balkan route, migration from and through Southeastern Europe. So the floor is yours, Robert.
Thank you, Florian. Hello, everyone. Yes, as Florian mentioned, I'm a fellow researcher at the institutes and also a researcher at the Center for Migration Studies in Poznan, in Poland. And so now I will share my presentation with you. I hope that everything goes fine. Do you see it? Wonderful. So I titled my presentation, The Balkan Route, the Recent History of Migration from and through West and Southeastern Europe. And this is a pretty general subject, as you can guess, but I put it like this because it's work in process. So it's a result of my research interest, which I conducted in different places and in different times. And at a certain point, they merged. So yeah, with the spirit of the Brownbag seminar, I decided to discuss with you something which occurs my mind recently. Okay, so I started my fieldwork in Tetovo, in northern Macedonia, close to Kosovo. Tetovo, in recent decades, has been a fast developing town which has gone through desindustrialization, rapid and uncontrolled urbanization, but also what is important here, outgoing and incoming migration. Tetovo is 50 kilometers far away from Skopje, of course in Macedonia. But as I mentioned, after a couple of years there, actually I started my PhD topic, or my PhD with research on Tetovo, on transition of Tetovo. But due to curvy path of my fieldwork, I ended up in Preševo. And Preševo is maybe 100 kilometers far away from Tetovo. Let me come back to the previous slide. It's right here. So it's quite close, but already in Serbia, also on the border with Kosovo. But Preševo, unlike Tetovo, it's not buzzing town, but rather calm, depopulated or depopulating town. It also went through massive desindustrialization, also outgoing migration and incoming migration. Tetovo and Preševo are both inhabited mostly by Albanian majority. In Tetovo, it's around 70% of population, maybe more. We don't know because the census hasn't been conducted for a while. And in Preševo, it's around 90%. So Preševo, it's a very interesting place because it had faced very interesting incoming migration, if we can call it so, because it's very particular. In 2015 and 2016, through sleepy and this depopulating town, more than 1 million of refugees, plus probably a few thousands of journalists, NGO workers, volunteers, and some smugglers passed through. And suddenly Preševo became the epicenter of the refugee crisis where all media were reporting from. However, at the backstage of the dramatic events occurring in that period were inhabitants of Preševo, who have also aspiration to emigrate from the red zone, as they call it, the borderland between Serbia, Kosovo, and Northern Macedonia. So in 2015 and 16, I was conducting my research, writing Preševo, and in the rare and short moments when refugees were not arriving in thousands, local and international volunteers reflect on the situation they were facing. And among Albanian volunteers, I could hear a faint string of envy. They envied that refugees from Middle East and Africa could reach Germany in few days through exceptional Balkan corridor, which operated for a few months in 2015 and 16. So here you see Balkan route, which is a bit different, a bit broader, and Balkan corridor was part of Balkan route, very exceptional corridor where people were able, if they had enough resources and strength, were able to pass from Greece to Germany within a few days. It was a place where people were moving fast, but also detained. Since I don't have much time to discuss this difference, I can discuss it later if someone's interested. But let me come back to the inhabitants of Preševo. I talked to Burim. He's a 30 years old single man, and he told me, observing all the massive influx of refugees, and he said, "Look, man, all these people one day will reach Germany. They are lucky. With support of Merkel, they will have good lives. We'll be stuck here. We also would like to get there, but no one will welcome us." And these few words actually stick to my mind. And after writing and defending my PhD, I'm still wondering what does it mean? What's he going to say? And I decided to find the interconnection of migration through and from the Southeastern Europe. And what I would like to do during this presentation is to actually connect this local migration with international migration. So my plan for today is first to shed some light on the EU border regime, which I believe has to do with everything what's going on, or maybe not with everything, but a lot of things which is going on in Southeastern Europe. Then I will describe the refugee movement after the closure of the Balkan corridor. So in the times when the EU border regime was rebuilt after the turmoil refugee crisis of 2015. And at the end, I will return to the impact of the same border regime on migration from, so local migration, from Southeastern Europe to EU, to Western Europe. And consequently, hopefully, I will search for some points of entanglements of these two migration flows. Observing the EU debate on migration, one could argue that there is a battle for highest qualified migrants who could fill the gap in the labor market and build the European wealth. It thus follows that most of the EU countries pursue a neoliberal migration logic, causing the inescapable dilemma. And this predicament, Peter Anderson explained in the introduction to his book, The Wall Around West, is how to make Western world borders impenetrable for unwanted migrants, but porous enough to allow goods to circulate without constraints. In other words, the question here is how to secure the borders while simultaneously making them business friendly. And these conflicting interests are based on the fact that some countries want to minimize immigration in hope of protecting the cultural identity or welfare state, and others encourage good exchange and immigration in order to address the growing demographic imbalance and workforce shortage. The solution rests on securing the external EU borders, which is supposed to function as a filter rather than a wall which we often see in media reports. Therefore, the role of the border control is not protecting the territory, but instead ordering the movement of people and the different hierarchical positioning. And it's all because the freedom of movement actually serves not to people, but to the needs of the market. The border control is usually not wall-like physical construction that has clear-cut division, but they are composed of high-tech invisible structures diffusing the territories of national states. The integration of global markets requires the borders act as a bridge for cross-border economic exchange and allow for flow of wanted people, skilled, educated, easily integrated migrants, and keeping the unwanted migrants and refugees far away from the EU borders, and thus creating on the fringes of the EU buffer zones, or as some research call it, dumping grounds. The borders thus function as disciplining entities that produce both mobility and immobility, namely allowing certain groups to move while immobilizing others. And the crucial role in this process of filtering is played by the migration apparatus. This picture, which you can see on the slide, is a front page of the book written by George Feldman, who is author of who invented the notion of migration apparatus. And he described it as migration management comprising different migration policy agendas, generic regulatory mechanism, and policy implementation, which is only connected with each other via internet platforms or databases, but is completely disconnected from the reality that migrants and refugees have to deal with during their journeys. So basically, it's a net of information databases, which is operating by bureaucrats who haven't seen often the reality on the ground. And migration apparatus consists of embassies, consulates, or, for example, airports. Yet another important element of it are buffer zones, where the filtering process takes place. In the case of Southeastern Europe, the buffer zones were created in the result of agreement between the EU and the candidates for membership in the EU. These agreements exemplify states' efforts to regulate global human circulation. And these political arrangements with often semi-authoritarian countries lie at the heart of externalization of the EU border management that can be defined as shifting certain responsibilities for border control beyond territorial edges of the EU, of course, in exchange for benefits. In practice, as Sandro Mesandra and Brent Nelson argue, the externalization of the border control consists of establishment of offshore detention facilities, the interception of diversion of vessels, cooperation in deportation procedure, surveillance of migration routes, or the use of digital databases used to spot migrant population. And this picture, which you can see, is a picture from Preševo, taken just 1 month ago. And this military car has nothing to do with migration. Actually, it has something to do with the issues on the border with Kosovo. But what I want to show is the car right here. It's a black Jeep on Austrian Viennese plates. And in this car are 2 border guards from Austria wearing Austrian border police suits. And what they do, they check refugees leaving the reception center, which you can see on the background. So they check the documents. They check documents of the taxi driver, which is on the left side here in the Octavia, it's called Octavia. And also they observe the work of local border police. And if they have any doubts, they are allowed to control, to suggest, if I may say, other solution to the border guards. And in Preševo, there are not only Austrian border guards, but also Hungarian, Polish, Czech, and so on and so forth. And they are there because of the mutual agreement with Frontex, which operates on external EU borders. And now, following these thoughts of externalization of the EU border, I would like to show how this EU border regime shapes the movement of refugees in Serbia. And then I will return, or I will go to migration from Preševo. So, in order to regain control over the European external borders after the frenzy 2015, the EU enforced the filtering, priority, and relocation programs. A crucial part of this project were hotspots. The hotspots are places in the buffer zones at the entry point to the EU where economic migrants are imprecisely and arbitrarily filtered from genuine refugees and then immobilized and deported, while the genuine refugees were to be transferred to the EU countries. And this is how it should work, at least in ideal type hotspot. However, as some of you might know, due to the slow relocation process caused by the rising anti-migration rhetoric in the EU, lack of solidarity and responsibility sharing among EU member states, the hotspots today often turn to overcrowded detention centers when human rights and sanitary rules are suspended and people are often forcefully detained. The hotspot approach is backed by the normalization of tremendous violence and pushbacks used by border guards, often supported by the European Border and Coastal Guard Agency, in short, Frontex. During these illegal pushbacks from one country to another, refugees are not only beaten with sticks, kicked, punched, but also robbed, and their personal items are destroyed. And these radical acts of violence towards unarmed children and adults have become regular and systematic. It is more and more evident that physical and psychological violence as a border deterrence is a new practice that emerged on the external borders in the course of refugee crisis and aftermath. And now, this pushbacks and extreme violence you can see not only in Southeastern Europe, but also in western flanks of the EU on Polish-Belarusian border. And this picture, which you can see, it's taken on Croatian-Bosnian border, where the border police is pushing back people using, of course, violence. Consequently, refugee movement is denied, and they are stuck in Serbia or in general in Balkan states in the buffer zone of the EU. These people, despite immobilization on the doorstep to the EU, keep moving, and they rarely stay in the government-run transit and asylum centers, but instead travel around Serbia, not only from north to south, as you can see. This is the map which I draw by myself, and here you can see the trajectories of migrant movement in the within Serbian borders. So you can see that people from Preševo, they travel to Belgrade, then from Belgrade to Sombor, Subotica, Šid, and when they give a try, they try to cross the border. When they push back, they go back to Subotica, rest a couple of days, search for money, search for resources, cure themselves, and try again. If they don't manage here, or they don't manage in Romania, they go to Croatia. If they aren't able to cross the border with Croatia, they go to border with Bosnia, and so forth and so on. And what you can see, it's something which I called hypermobility. So people are constantly moving. If they are not catched by the police and not forcefully detained, they will be moving around the country, but also around Southeastern Europe. Sometimes they even reach the EU, they reach Croatia, they reach Slovenia, but if they are not lucky, they will be pushed back to Serbia or Bosnia, or sometimes they also go this way through Kosovo, Montenegro. Yeah. So Elena Fontanari explains that hypermobility intervenes with fragmented circuits caused by endless waiting for resident permits, queuing for food, accommodation, and repetitively applying for subsidiary protection, which in the end leads to prolonged, precarious, and unsettled life. I claim that this restless movement outside of the EU helps them withstand the periods of suspension and eventually cross the border. And by analyzing the refugee movements, as well as informal conversation and interviews which I conducted with the refugees, I reviewed that migrant movement on the doorstep of the EU brought them hope of crossing the border and eventually of reaching a safe country with the possibility of developing a sustainable existence. So simply making a good life, finally, after years of precarious journey. Nevertheless, it is obvious that this high level of geographical movement creates a border control paradox. The more states impose movement adversary conditions, the more refugees feel they have no choice, but they must continue moving. So, hence, it confirms the Sabina Hess argument that the European border regime does not stop the movement of refugees and migrants, rather it keeps people caught in mobility and transform border regions in the zones of heightened circulation. Now let me change slightly the focus and turn to the EU impact or impact of the EU border regime on migration from Southern Eastern Europe. In my case, is Albanian population from Tetovo and Preševo. Immigration for Albanians community in Yugoslavia next to employment in public sector and agriculture was a strategy to support the multi-generational households. However, the dissolution of Yugoslavia and international sanctions made legal immigration to the EU more difficult than ever. So the bilateral agreements were cancelled and the red passport devalued. Simultaneously, the local economy collapsed and people were left with empty hands. Consequently, Albanians could rely on circular migration called Gurbet or Pechalba, depends from the region. So it's like 10 months outside, abroad, working, and 2 months back in the homes. So this kind of migration changed. Actually, they had to search for new migration patterns. And one of the few options at hand was legalization of stay in the EU through marriage with the EU citizen or asylum request. However, to submit the application, one had to reach first the EU. So Albanians typically travel first to Belgrade and then to Subotica, where they irregularly cross border with Hungary, using usually facilitator. After lodging the application for international protection in Hungary, the vast majority of applicants absconded and traveled by bus, trains, vans, or other means to other EU countries, usually Germany, Austria, or Switzerland, and often applied again. And this route clearly overlapped with the path taken by refugees from the Middle East in 2015 till now. However, within the time, crossing the green border became more difficult due to the EU militarization of external borders and agreements with the candidate countries. Southeastern European states were obliged to tie the border control to protect the EU external borders. Of course, if they wanted to open new chapters of EU accession negotiations. And as explained by Marta Stojic-Mitrovic, among these agreements, or among states which signed this agreement was Serbia, which in order to pursue integration with the EU had to implement legislative and other institutional changes that the EU demanded. And in practice, this meant that the country's legislation, institutions, and official practices in the key areas such as security and migration were harmonized with those existing in the EU. Thus, Serbia had to securitize its border and sign the agreement on admission of failed asylum applicants. As a result, many failed Albanian asylum applicants, irregular workers, and those whose residence permit had expired were deported to hometowns and villages, some of them with 5-year entry ban to the EU. This fact was reflected in the numbers showing that Albanians were among top groups deported from the EU. Although one should bear in mind that this data is error-prone because statistics are usually based on nationality, not ethnicity. So it's very difficult to distinguish if these Albanians are from Serbia, Macedonia, or Kosovo, or Albania. Furthermore, the borders, which in the past had been just penetrable lines on the map separating the former federal states of Yugoslavia and later independent states, in the course of integration with the EU and influx of refugees from Middle East, became highly securitized and militarized. They became simply hard borders, tangible and visible. And this is very clear in region of Preševo Valley Miratovac and Lojane. They are two Albanian communities living in two different states, in Serbia and Macedonia. If you want to cross the border, regular border, green border, it's around 10 minutes on foot. But this border was closed. And now people must travel from Lojane through Tabanovce, crossing border to Preševo and then to Miratovac. And all this journey takes around 1 hour by car. So it actually can give you an idea what kind of impact it might have for local community. But the reward for the hard control of Southeastern European states' borders and the readmission agreement was visa liberation for Western Balkans. But from my observation, despite being a significant improvement for many citizens of the EU candidate states, it did not fully lift the obstacles which they are facing. And here I'd like to come back to Burim, which I cited before. And he told me, many people from Preševo work in Europe. Some of them work illegally, some legally through work and travel programs. But usually they work at McDonald's or this sort of places. At McDonald's, you can develop. There is no way for promotion. With the money they earn, they can't do nothing. Everything is getting expensive here. With this money, one can't pay for apartment and bills here in Preševo and there in Germany or wherever in the EU. This situation will get worse because work and travel will not satisfy our needs and we don't have chance for better work there. The EU, it's killing us. And this last phrase, the EU, it's killing us, he has repeated several times. I've been hearing it also from different research participants. And Burim himself worked for his brother in Switzerland for 3 summer months in 2001, but work permit and fees related to the employment of field nationals did not pay off, and he was pushed to informal economy. Thus, inhabitants of Preševo and Tetovo do not have access to open labor markets except from governmental programs which recruit highly qualified non-EU citizens, causing unprecedented brain drain in Southeastern Europe. Another option is illegal work or work and travel programs, which allows for rather precarious jobs. And for these people, the mobility gain thanks to the visa-free movement made them move back and forth between home and the temporary offer of an illegal work in the EU. My interview, instead of traveling between these two places, would like remain home with families and friends. And simply, often because of this reason, they decided to leave the job in the EU and come back to their hometowns and stay there. Because when they told me, look, I'm spending 500 euro for apartment in Germany, then another 500 I need for food and living here, and 500 I send to home, and basically 500 euro I can make in Macedonia or Serbia if I find some relatively good job. So to conclude, the EU border regime creates precarious movements and conditions for exploitation, but does not allow to fully settle down in the EU. It is designed to ensure security, rule of law, and free movement of privileged ones, while at the same time time keeping away other citizens of the so-called third countries, refugees, and uneducated and unprivileged, who accordingly became subject to ever more rigorous rule that allow ordinary entry. The EU border regime keeps migrants and refugees in precarious buffer zones. These buffer zones are overflowed with irregular and chaotic movement of people who economic attractiveness and low potentiality is perceived as burden on the welfare state. And that's it. Thank you very much. If you have any question, I'll be happy to answer.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert, for your presentation. And herewith, I would like to open the floor for questions. So whoever would like to go first. Bilgin, you are first. Go ahead. You just have to unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Oh, now it works. Sorry.
Now we hear you. Yes, perfect.
Hi, everyone, and hello, Robert. Thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting. And yes, I have a few comments or questions, a mix of questions and comments. I hope you don't mind. And
sure.
We already communicated, as you know, I have a very overlapping research interest, so because I was very eager to listen to you, what you're doing. Well, first, one is just a thing in one aspect in the presentation that I wasn't sure why you brought this up, or if that actually has a particular factor in your argument. You did, you outlined the EU border regime, and then you mentioned the hotspot approach, which is not implemented in the regions that you're speaking of, right? It is implemented in Greece and in Italy. In our research, we speak of hotspot-like places, and that is what I would see that, right? When you describe Serbia, it would be more like a hotspot-like place where some of the procedures are implemented. But did you bring this up because you argue that it is exactly the general introduction of the hotspot approach that creates also Serbia and Albania also as a buffer zone, right? Because in our work, we describe Greece as a buffer zone where this hotspot approach is implemented. Right. So that just as a clarification, I'd like to know. And I really find this super important and interesting how you look at the effects of the European border regime at the quote unquote peripheries, right? And how it reintroduces an ongoing, asymmetry as it is there. I was wondering where you're taking this research. What is it that you're planning? I came 2 minutes late. Maybe you said it in the very beginning. I apologize for that. But what do you plan? Where are you taking this research further? And lastly, I have a question about ethics. Of course, this topic of the European border regime is extremely, it's not complicated, but it's in the midst of an ongoing reproduction of violence, right? As we now see at the Polish-Belarusian border and at the whole outer frontier. So the question of how to do research is something that always concerns me. I always think about that. I'd like to hear from you when you look at the mobilities, right? About how people move, right? What kind of precautions or considerations you have, what this information about the movement, right, of the migrants itself could contribute to. I mean, I was just wondering if you have also sort of thoughts and concerns about that and how you try to come about that, how you would like to encounter that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bilgin. Robert, would you like to take several questions or would you like to answer this first?
Maybe I'll answer first because I'm afraid that I will get lost.
Of course, go ahead. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
So thank you for these comments and questions. So I will start with the hotspots because it was also relatively complicated issue for me, because as you mentioned, like, officially hotspots are not implemented in Serbia, and I totally agree with this. But if you look at the reception centers in particular in 2015 and 16, when the hotspot idea was growing and implemented, the reception center in Prešov, for example, work like this. So what the aim of this place was to register people and select, verify, and those who belong to three nationalities, Syrian, Afghani, and Iraqi, were able to use the Balkan corridor. The rest was left without this possibility, and they were not able to use the state-organized trains, buses, and so on. So although it's not and it wasn't officially implemented, I see it as such. I see at least parallels. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I would like to hear from you more. Yeah. So this is how I see hotspots in Serbia. But now, of course, situation has changed, because these places are not selecting people anymore, because the relocation program doesn't work. So these camps work as transit places where people can stay for a couple of days. They get one more permission to travel through Serbia. They try to reach border, and if they are not lucky, they'll be pushed back to Prešov. So there's a lot of contradiction in this movement and work of bureaucrats. About my plans and research. So yeah, and at the beginning I mentioned that I started my research in Tetovo, and I was focused on transition of post-Yugoslav states. And from this research emerged a topic of emigration from Tetovo, but also the immigration, because a lot of people come back to Tetovo. Tetovo is a very lively place, student town. A lot of people are coming, but in the same time, a lot of people are leaving. So there I had a chance to observe and hear the stories of immigration and the reasons for immigration and patterns of immigration. And then, because of some issues with border police, I had to leave Tetovo in 2015 in summer. So, and I was waiting for visa, and I went to Prešov, and I knew that in Prešov it's kind of hotspot. So I went to see what's going on there. And I was waiting for visa for a couple of months, and I decided, okay, maybe I should start my research here. And this is how I engage in pro-refugee initiatives in Prešov, and I started to do my fieldwork there. And how to do research? I think this is connected with the second question. So currently, I'm doing research in Southeastern Europe, right? Mostly in Serbia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. But I have a little project in Poland regarding pro-refugee initiatives and their cooperations with formal institutions. And really useful, I found activist research. So just being part of these groups, I can observe what's going on, how they cooperate, how they work, how they function. So before I came to Austria, I was on Polish-Belarusian border, basically in the forest, searching for refugees and helping them out. And the same I did in Prešov, where I was simply trying to help, and by the same time I was collecting information. And of course, there's a question of ethics, right? Because I don't write on my t-shirt that I'm a researcher and I'm collecting data. So I try to inform people as much as I can, as broad as I can. I'm a researcher, but I'm also an activist, and I'm here to help, but also to collect data, which hopefully will shed some light on the situation here. So instead of writing papers, scientific papers, apart from writing scientific papers, I also try to take part in discussions, write to Polish media to tell what's going on, to give some insights. So I believe this what is our also duty as academics, to not close ourselves in our bubble, but also try to reach wider public with. So I think that's and maybe one more thing regarding the ethics of doing research in this particular settings. I'm writing a paper with my colleague where we are arguing that ethnographic interview actually it's not ethical. I don't have time to explore this more, but whenever it's done, I can forward it to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Robert. We have two questions at the moment. I would like to ask them both. Nejmettin, do you want to go first? And then we'll have Anna.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to go just shortly and fast because I'm really informated about this zone. I come from Kumanovo, which is from the village Opaje, which is far away from Lojane, 5 kilometers with a border zone with Serbia. And I would like to ask something about this. Did the non-opening of the border of Lojane and Miratoce made to approve the illegal migration of the migrants from one country to another country without going to the hotspots which they were created in Preševo? Because before the created hotspots, which they were also in Tabanovce and in Preševo, there were, how can I say it, black hotspots, but they were created from migrants, actually in the village of Lojane. So that was my question. So, if it's possible, yeah. Thank you.
Maybe we can take Anna's question as well. Anna, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. My question or comment is related to this part where you presented this, I think you called it the concept of hypermobility, and showed this map about some data. I suppose the refugees are moving through the Serbia. And this perspective is in sharp contrast with our usual perception of refugees, for example, in Serbia, in the Balkans, that they are confined to the refugee camps and just waiting to cross the border. And that's why I think this perspective is potentially very interesting. But I wonder, is there some kind of a data set to support this idea that they are moving like freely through Serbia? Because from some of my experience, I have a chance to conduct one research in Šid. This is one detention camp in Serbia. And from my experience, I know that this question of moving from the camp is really restricted in this particular camp. So they're not like free to go out from the camp. Not just because of the police, but also because of local communities who are not welcoming refugees. You know, they very hardly can go to neighboring cities and just, you know, move around. So my question is, what kind of support or where we can find this data that can actually show us this moving through Serbia? Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. Go ahead.
All right. So let's start from the last question. Yeah, what we are saying is very interesting, and again, I agree with you that, for example, in Šid, the mobility it's not that frequent. I mean, people are often detained in the camps, but from what I observe, it all depends from the periods when we are doing our research. So in 2015 and 16 and 17, I think there was more freedom of movement, and when we were getting closer to 2019, 20, and the pandemic, the freedom of movement was limited, and it was justified by pandemic, right? So that we cannot people let out because we have exceptional measures, exceptional situations. So we keep them there in the camps. So it all depends about which period we are talking about. I conduct my research in 2015 and 16, a bit more in 2017, and now I was back for a couple of weeks. So my data refer to the period right after the closure of the Balkan corridor. But from what I saw, there are people moving, right? There are people walking around the highways. There are people on the bus stations. Also, there are sometimes that they are caught, they are sent back. All depends on the region, because in Sheets, from what I know, the local population is not that in favor of refugees, as opposed, for example, to Preševo community, which is pretty much, if not in favor, but supporting in this way or another refugees. So I don't have hard data to say that this number of people are traveling currently through the country, but maybe the data which shows the places in the reception centers and an amount of refugees in the country can say us, because if there's more people in Serbia than we have people places in the reception centers, then it means that they are roaming around. And about this hypermobility, I wrote a paper and I published it in journal Movements. So perhaps I can send it to you. Maybe you will find it informative.
Please.
Helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the first question, the border opening in Lojane, did it cause the influx of refugees to Serbia? That was the question. Did I understood it correctly?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
My question was about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's a good question. No, but I think not really. Not really. What opened the Balkan corridor was the permission of Macedonian Serbian state to cross the country for refugees. So they issue 72 hours travel permit, which allowed them to cross the borders. But for some reasons they didn't want to let people go through official border crossings, like in Tabanovce, for example, and direct people to Lojane and Miratovec. And then they close it, of course, right? So it's not functional anymore. So I think I can't answer your question directly. I'm sorry. I will think about it, but thank you for this comment. It's a good question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions we have from the audience? There's a chance there's still time for a couple of more. If anybody would like to ask Robert a question. Maybe I ask you, because again, you were referring, you said your main bulk of your research was during the peak of the so-called Balkan route, but it's changed, of course, a lot since then. But to which degree do you see this shift? This shift in both local attitudes and policies And you said, of course, the pandemic provided a pretext for some changes, but already right before the pandemic, there were some demonstrations in Belgrade against migrants. So I'm just kind of wondering, do you see the shift towards a more repressive and constraining attitudes towards migrants in Serbia, let's say, or other countries you've looked at, a result of the shift inside the European Union? Or is there some kind of local processes? How do you, what are the turning points in a certain way in your mind for the kind of from more mobility and let's say more laissez-faire to more restrictive approaches by the local authorities, but also by citizens and their attitudes?
Mm-hmm. So what I see from the EU side, bureaucrat side, that they are more in favor of hard border control than it was in 2015. And the best example we have in Poland, that no one is calling Poland to treat refugees in more human way. Actually, the opposite. The Frontex says Poland is doing a good job. None of the EU states send, I don't know, messages that this situation should change, that they should follow the rules and laws which we have produced in the past and which to a certain degree work. So certainly there's a shift in the EU politics towards not receiving migrants and refugees. And the same we can observe in the southeastern external border, that the only option to apply for asylum is actually to parachute refugee to EU border. There's no official way to seek asylum in Poland, in EU, unless you find yourself in the EU territory. If you go to official border crossing and you say, I want to seek asylum, you'll be pushed back. Mm. So the tendencies are against refugees. And from what I heard from activists and NGO workers, there's also a shift in local population. And probably this shift is caused by this prolonged crisis situation where people are roaming around borderlands, trying to cross. They are pushed back. They sleep in center of the towns, bus stations. Sometimes they get into the summer huts. They really destroy things, or steal. They just look for shelter. So this situation causes tensions between local community and refugees, and it's very worrying because I don't see that it will change soon.
Indeed. Thank you. Alyssa Helms has one question, and that would be the last. Alyssa, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, my isn't set up. Yeah, maybe I can. I think Florian was partially asking about the sort of local reception, and I didn't quite get where you were situated in Preševo or Tetovo. I got the feeling that you were participating in aid to refugees in some way, but so I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I'm thinking of some work by Piero Redzepi, who talks about local population in Muslim majority areas being more supportive towards refugees and migrants, whereas the official Islamic authorities were actually trying to discourage aid to them and sort of drawing a barrier between good European Muslims and dangerous ones from other places. So I'm just wondering if there's a discourse there that involves solidarity on the basis of religion, on the basis of common humanity. Can you say a bit more about the local reception? And I'm asking this because I've been doing ethnographic work in Bihać on that border. So these are the issues that I'm interested in.
Thanks, Yossi. Go ahead, Robert.
So indeed, there is a more positive attitude of local community towards refugees in Preševo. And what I have heard is because I heard from Albanians living there that we were refugees too. We know what does it mean. So this is how they justify their help. So these people were often the first one who support refugees in 2015 and 16. So they organized themselves among the youth office, an NGO working in Preševo. And way before international community arrived and started to help, there were these people who were providing this humanitarian aid. And it was quite exceptional because the Hoxha opened the mosque, for example, for refugees, and they could stay there for a couple of weeks, I guess. Then local community, I haven't seen actually this part, when the local community opened the houses to refugees. And according to my research partners, there were people who live in Switzerland. They had houses built in Preševo, and they decided to, some of them said to just open a few houses and let people in. So as I say, I haven't seen this, but I have seen a lot of people helping, also a lot of people using refugees. So offering taxi to Belgrade for high price, or bringing them to the nearest woods and then saying, here is Belgrade. So these cases happen too. But yet, recalling the experience of being refugee or immigrant, it was very often. I could hear it. I could also see engagement of local community in this refugee issue. And even today, I think from Preševo, you cannot hear that there's some anti-refugee rhetoric in the town. Rather not. And people are, I think, still or neutral or pro, from what this is my observation. Or at least this was in 2015, 16, and 17. In 2021, I just talked to some people, but I didn't conduct it very wide ethnographic research.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks for those questions. I think it's our time to wrap up for today. We're a bit over time. So Robert, thank you very much for sharing your research with us, and good luck with transforming also your research into a book. And as a reminder, next week, we're going to have the last Brownbag seminar. It's going to be Samantha Guzman, who's going to be presenting about Kosovo Albanian political and nationalist organizations in Central Europe in the 60s until the 1990s. So I hope you'll all join us for that. And I wish you all a good day. And bye, Robert, and bye, everybody. And thanks for joining.